Welcome to Sinai. When we get to Exodus 21 and we discover that here at the heart of the Pentateuch we have laws about not boiling baby goats in its mother's milk, what to do if your ox gores someone, how to build an altar, laws about slavery. We've reached the heart of the Torah, and we've come to some of the most difficult texts that we're going to run into in the Bible. So again, I say welcome to Sinai. And what I want to do in this brief lecture is to give, again, a missional framework for understanding what we've come upon. Because here we have Exodus 21, 1 to 11, and we have a laws on how God's people are to conduct their handling of slaves, which seems deeply ironic given the fact that we've spent the first part of the book talking about how God liberated his people from illegitimate oppression and illegitimate slavery and unleashed them and freed them so that they could then serve the Lord. And it seems a little strange now that God's newly liberated people actually have laws given to how they're going to conduct their handling of human slavery. Now, again, if you've looked at these texts, you know that there are the slavery that was practiced in the scriptures different than slavery that was, say, practiced in the Americas and of a different type. But we also have to say these are important texts even for today because there are more slaves in the 21st century than there were in the past, just on pure numbers. Most of the slaves today are slaves in the sex industry, especially in Southeast Asia, but we also still have a slave trade going on in certain parts of Africa to this day, and even parts of the Caribbean, if you do a little bit of research into that. So this still is a problem. But I want to shape this. Why would it be that God would put institutions into the scripture that are obviously deeply offensive to modern people, because these are texts that we probably wish that weren't here. So I want to put this on a little bit of a missional framework. First, we want to step back and look at the context. If you have your scriptures, look at Exodus 20:22, and I have it right here in the Hebrew and in a couple of English translations. But what I want you to in particular take a look at is about a half a verse into 22 where it says, Tomar, El B'nai Yisrael Ata Re'itim Ki. This is that phrase, thus you will say to the sons or to the Israelites, you yourselves have seen. Where have we seen that language? Yeah, that's right. It's back in Exodus chapter 19. So notice the structure that we have. This invites us to read these texts in conversation and in the wider context. And if you look again back to Exodus 19, you can see the same kind of phrase. You will speak to the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen. So this is the same language. Now, if we look at this contextually, this invites us to see Exodus 19 as we mentioned in the video from last week, as a general statement. Listen to my voice, keep my covenant, then you'll be out of all peoples on earth my treasured possession. The whole earth is mine. You will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And we talked about last week on how Israel was to be a missional community that reflects God's character to the world, for the world, and in the world. Well, what does that look like? What's it mean to be holy? What's it mean to keep God's covenant? Well, last week in the Ten Commandments, we have a partial distillation of what that looks like with 10 commandments that give a little bit more specifics about what that looks like. And we talked last week on how essentially we have love God, love neighbor, with a Sabbath as a connecting point between those two pieces. Now, look at our text for today. The book of the covenant, which runs from Exodus 20:22 essentially through chapter 23, are now very detailed laws that puts real specifics on what it looks like to keep God's covenant, what it looks like to keep each of those 10 commandments. Again, let's go back to the text and look at this. Look at Exodus 20 22, and let's listen to it in the ESV. Thus you shall say to the people of Israel, you have seen for yourselves that I talk with you from heaven. It's a reminder of hearing the 10 words. You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold. An altar of earth you shall not make for me, and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. If you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stones, for if you wield your tools on it, you profane it, and you shall not go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness not be exposed on it. And then we move into Exodus 21, where we have the laws of about slavery. Now, what does this do for us contextually? Well, notice that these are the opening 2 sets of laws in the book of the covenant. And what do they deal with? They deal with essentially the danger of idolatry and of false worship. That's the love God piece. And then the second law, which has to do with how Israel was to handle slaves, that's a snapshot of what it looks like to love your neighbor, because at the end of the day, and there's different level of slavery, again, slightly different, but at the end of the day, a slave is a marginalized person. They're an at-risk person, especially the female slaves in this context. And these laws give protections to make sure that persons in these marginalized positions aren't abused. You may also notice how the text sneaks the Sabbath in here as well by allowing the male slaves to be released on the 7th year. By the way, Deuteronomy 15 and its slave laws extends that to both male and female slaves. So notice that in this missional framework, the Book of the Covenant opens up with 2 key object lessons of what it looks like to love God and love neighbor. And I would invite you to ponder, does it not make Scripture more powerful to show that it directly confronts institutions within human cultures that suffocate living, that can be used to abuse people, and make sure from the beginning of God's people moving into the land that Israel is going to be different? And even if Israel was going to continue on with the practice of slavery, which again was oftentimes bankruptcy protection, that it was going to be a different kind of slavery, one that wasn't permanent, or in the case of women, if they were being purchased to be a wife, that they would be wives and not simply objects of sexual gratification. So when you look at it that way, I'm actually grateful that we have a Scripture that engages at the messy parts of human life and tries to bring redemption to that. Again, if you have any questions, we'll talk about this for the next week in class. Thanks for your good work.